The scorching desert sun seared my skin as I walked across the hot sand toward the imposing structure ahead. Djoser's pyramid stood against the blue sky, its ancient stones silently telling stories of millennia past. As a newly graduated archaeologist, I could hardly contain my excitement about being part of the new excavation team at the Saqqara complex. But there was something in the air, a nearly palpable tension that made my hair stand on end despite the heat. Perhaps it was just the nerves of my first day on the job, but as I approached the pyramid's entrance, I couldn't shake the feeling that invisible eyes were watching me from the shadows. The interior of the pyramid was cool and damp, a welcome relief from the relentless heat outside. The smell of ancient stone and sand filled my nostrils as I turned on my flashlight and moved through the narrow corridors. My footsteps echoed strangely, as if the sound was being muffled by something unseen. Suddenly, I heard a distant whisper from the depths of the pyramid. I froze, my heart racing. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling slightly. Silence was the only response. I shook my head, trying to rid myself of the unease settling in my stomach. It was just the wind, I told myself. Ancient structures like this always made strange noises. I continued my exploration, making notes in my journal about the inscriptions on the walls. But as I ventured deeper into the pyramid, I couldn't help but notice that the shadows seemed to move at the corners of my vision, dancing and contorting in ways that couldn't be explained by the light from my flashlight alone. Then I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the wall in front of me, among the ancient hieroglyphs, there was a fresh handprint, made with what appeared to be still wet blood. My heart raced, and I took a step back, nearly stumbling. How was this possible? I was the first to enter the pyramid today. As I stared at the bloody mark, it began to slowly drip down the wall, forming symbols I didn't recognize. A high-pitched scream echoed through the corridors, making me jump. It took me a moment to realize the scream had come from me. I turned to run back to the entrance, but suddenly I couldn't remember the way. All the corridors looked the same, stretching endlessly into the darkness. Panic began to grip me as I ran blindly, my flashlight flickering and failing. The walls seemed to close in around me, the air growing heavier and harder to breathe. Ancient voices began to whisper in my ears, in a language I didn't understand but somehow knew was cursing me. I stumbled and fell, my flashlight rolling away and going out, leaving me in total darkness. Lying on the cold stone floor, I felt something move in the darkness around me. Cold, dry fingers touched my face, and I screamed again, flailing wildly. The voices grew louder, reaching a deafening chorus of wails and accusations. I squeezed my eyes shut, wishing it were all just a terrible nightmare. Suddenly, everything went quiet. I opened my eyes slowly, fearing what I might see. To my surprise, I was back at the entrance of the pyramid, the desert sun shining outside. Shaky and confused, I stumbled into the daylight, wondering if I had imagined the whole thing. But when I looked at my hands, I saw they were covered in a dark, sticky substance that looked like dried blood. In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself it had been a hallucination caused by the heat and stress. I immersed myself in my work, cataloging artifacts and studying the inscriptions on the pyramid's walls. But at night, in my dreams, I returned to those dark corridors, chased by ancient shadows and furious voices. A week after the incident, I was working late in a newly discovered chamber when my flashlight began to flicker. The familiar panic started to rise in my throat, but I forced it back. It was just a coincidence, I told myself. Nothing supernatural was happening. That's when I saw the inscription on the wall in front of me, one that hadn't been there moments before. The hieroglyphs glowed with their own light, pulsing as if alive. Against my will, I began to translate the ancient words. "He who disturbs the sleep of the dead must pay the price." I read aloud, my voice echoing strangely in the empty chamber. As soon as I finished speaking, a cold wind blew through the room, extinguishing my flashlight and plunging everything into darkness. My heart pounded so hard I was sure it could be heard throughout the Saqqara complex. I tried to move but found I was paralyzed, unable to lift a finger. In the darkness, I heard footsteps approaching, the shuffle of bare feet on ancient stone. A faint light began to glow, revealing a figure that made my blood run cold. Standing before me was what could only be described as a living mummy. Ancient, tattered bandages covered a skeletal body, and glowing eyes stared at me from a partially decomposed face. The creature held an ankh, the Egyptian symbol of life, which emitted the eerie light illuminating the chamber. "You have disturbed our eternal rest," the mummy said in a voice that sounded like sand being blown by the wind. "Now you must join us in death or complete the task we left unfinished millennia ago." I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but stand there paralyzed with fear. But my body refused to obey. What task?" I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. The mummy extended a skeletal hand, its long, thin fingers pointing to the wall behind me. "The ritual must be completed. The portal must be closed before he awakens." I turned slowly, my muscles finally obeying, and saw that the wall behind me was no longer solid. Instead, there was a pitch-black opening, from which emanated a supernatural cold and a low, rhythmic sound like deep breathing. "You have until dawn," the mummy said. "Fail, and your soul will be consumed along with the rest of this world." With those words, the creature disappeared, taking the ghostly light with it. I was left alone in the darkness, with only the sound of breathing from the portal for company. The hours that followed were a blur of terror and desperation. Using only the faint light from my cell phone, which miraculously still worked, I began to decipher the inscriptions on the chamber walls. They spoke of an ancient and terrible god, asleep for millennia, whose awakening would bring the end of all life. The ritual to keep him asleep had to be performed every 1,000 years, and the deadline was fast approaching. As I worked frantically to understand and perform the ritual, strange things began to happen around me. Objects moved on their own, shadows danced on the walls, and voices whispered in my ears in long-forgotten languages. More than once, I thought I saw figures moving in the darkness beyond the reach of my cell phone's light. The ritual itself was complex and frightening. It involved a series of chants in ancient Egyptian, the drawing of specific symbols with my own blood, and the offering of something personal and precious. I hesitated at this last part until I remembered the medallion my grandmother had given me before she died. With tears in my eyes, I placed it on the makeshift altar I had constructed. As the ritual progressed, the air in the chamber grew heavier and more electric. The sound of breathing from the portal grew louder, turning into a low roar that made the walls tremble. Shadows began to stretch from the portal, trying to grasp my feet, but I stood firm, chanting the incantations with a voice that grew stronger with each word. When I finally reached the last part of the ritual, the roar had become a scream of rage that threatened to shatter my eardrums. The shadows had turned into solid tentacles that thrashed furiously, trying to prevent me from completing the closing of the portal. With a final cry of defiance, I spoke the last words of the ritual. There was a blinding flash of light and then silence. When my vision cleared, I saw that the portal had disappeared, leaving only a solid wall in its place. Exhausted and trembling, I fell to my knees. I had done it. The world was safe at least for another 1,000 years. But as a smile of relief began to form on my lips, I noticed something that made my heart sink. My hand, the one I had used to draw the symbols with blood, was starting to turn gray and mummified. The price of the ritual, I realized with horror, was my own life and youth. As the sun rose outside, shining into the chamber through a small opening in the ceiling, I felt my body age rapidly. My skin became wrinkled and dry, my muscles atrophied, and my bones grew fragile. In a matter of minutes, I had become something akin to the mummy that had visited me hours before. Now I am trapped here, an immortal guardian of Djoser's pyramid. My task is to wait for the next fool who dares to disturb this sacred place, and then pass on the burden I now bear. And as I wait, I pray that the next one is luckier than I was, or at least capable of doing what must be done when the time comes. For time passes quickly when you are immortal, and 1,000 years are nothing compared to the eternity that awaits me in this stone prison. And always, in the darkest corners of my mummified mind, I hear the distant whisper of that ancient being, patiently waiting for the chance to awaken and devour the world.